Welcome back to Intro to Religion, PHL 1030. We're going over Tim Bayne's book, Philosophy of Religion, a very short introduction. And in this video, we're going over the questions for exam 1 in part B, questions 7 and 8. Do you find any of Bayne's challenges to the temporal version of the cosmological argument for the existence of God convincing? Why or why not? That's question 7. And question 8, do you find any of Bayne's challenges to the atemporal version of the cosmological argument for the existence of God convincing? Why or why not? All right, this is covered on pages 27 through 33. So the cosmological argument for the existence of God, trying to prove the existence of God by appealing to the existence of the cosmos itself. The fact that the cosmos exists indicates there must be a God. That's what we're going over in this video. So it's chapter 3 of Bayne's book, and it's Arguments for the Existence of God. And he starts off in the subtitle, The Ambitions of Natural Theology. So he says, although religious authorities often laud the merits of faith, for many people proof is at the bottom line. Proof is the bottom line when it comes to matters of belief. When asked what he would say if brought face to face with God in the afterlife, Bertrand Russell is reputed to have responded, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. Is it possible to prove that God exists?" So then he breaks it down into 3 categories of attempts to prove God's existence, and they are the cosmological argument, the design argument, and the argument from religious experience. So in the next videos, we'll go over the design argument and the argument from religious experience, but in this one, we're going over the cosmological argument, and this deals with natural theology. So page 26, he says, the attempt to justify claims about the nature and existence of God on the basis of commonly accepted truths is known as natural theology. So Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, a doctor of the Catholic Church, is famous for advocating natural theology, that you can know about God just using the light of human reason, that you don't necessarily require divine revelation, an appeal to divine revelation as compiled in any scriptures, that just human reason itself can know about the existence of God and what God's will is by analyzing God, the structure of nature, and that the cosmos itself is structured by God and it holds the key to understanding all the moral laws. So in this very short introduction, he doesn't get into all those details, but he does bring in St. Thomas Aquinas. He says, the advocates of natural theology have traditionally aimed to provide demonstrative proof for God's existence, where a proof is demonstrative if it leaves no room for rational doubt. This approach can be found in the work of Thomas Aquinas. For the arguments for God's existence that Aquinas gives are presented as having premises that will strike all rational individuals as self-evidently true. So, self-evident truths, and the cosmological argument that Thomas Aquinas presents, one of them is, and it's his idea of the unmoved mover, and he was following Aristotle, is that everything that moves has a cause. There must therefore have been some original cause of movement that was not itself moved by anything. Now, that's not the exact same argument that's presented here. In this one, Tim Bayne breaks it down into the temporal version of the cosmological argument and the atemporal version. So on page 27, he says that the appeal to God's existence is proved by the existence of the cosmos, he says, has the prominent advocates of the cosmological argument include Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, who's also known as Averroes, Maimonides, Thomas Aquinas, and Leibniz. So the temporal version. Here's the temporal version of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's got 5 parts of this argument. Number 1, the universe began to exist. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. That's number 2. Number 3, the universe has a cause of its existence. Number 4, if the universe has a cause, then that cause must be personal, that is, it must be God. Number 5, therefore there is a God. So, analyzing this. So the question is, do you find any of Tim Bayne's challenges to the temporal version and the atemporal version of the cosmological argument for the existence of God convincing? So what are these challenges to this attempt to prove the existence of God? So the temporal version, the universe began to exist at some point in time. So then he goes on to talk about the nature of infinite sets, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Al-Ghazali said, oh, the universe must have had a beginning, because if it had no beginning and extends into the infinite past, then the number of orbits of Jupiter and Saturn would be equal because of the nature of infinite sets. Well, he said they would be equal, but that's clearly not possible because Jupiter it takes 12 years to orbit the sun, and Saturn takes 30 years. So since it would be impossible for the number of orbits of Jupiter and Saturn to be the same, and yet if there was an infinite past, they would be the same, therefore there could not have been an infinite past. And so then Tim Bayne talks about dealing with infinite sets. If you had an infinite set of all even numbers and then an infinite set of all whole numbers, so one had only 2, 4, 6, 8, the other had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and both of them extended to infinity, which one would have more numbers? You would think the one that includes odd and even numbers would have more, but since they both extend to infinity, they both have an infinite number of numbers. You can correlate each even number to an odd number and the even number, so 2 can be correlated to 1, 4 can be correlated to 2, 6 can be correlated to 3, 8 can be correlated to 4, and that can just go on to infinity. So that's all I'm going to say about that because it kind of complicates the issue. So coming back to what I would expect you to express in the essay, if you choose this as your exam answer, on page 29 at the bottom, he says, but although Al-Ghazali's argument seems to fail, other reasons can be given in support of one, meaning the universe began to exist at some point in time. And in fact, most advocates of the Kalam argument appeal to the Big Bang account of contemporary physics to motivate the claim that the universe had a beginning in time. So the Kalam argument is, I'm going to, on page 27, he says, much of the discussion surrounding this argument is focused on, number 1, the claim that the universe began to exist. Some advocates of the Kalam argument defend. So the word Kalam, it means, I can't find it here anymore, but it is, the Muslim philosophers came up with it. Here it is, the temporal version, which is often referred to as the Kalam argument in honor of its Arabic roots. Kalam is the Arabic term for word or speech, can be formulated as follows. Okay, so then it was the universe began to exist, and therefore God must have created it. All right, so the Big Bang. Most people believe in the Big Bang theory, which indicates that because the universe is expanding according to general relativity, in the past it must have been smaller. And if you go back far enough in the past, it must have been condensed into a single point called the singularity. And I'm going to talk about the singularity because it has many of the qualities of the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God that we are wondering if it's plausible to think such a being exists who created the universe. And I'll read a quote from Pope Pius XII, where he does equate the Big Bang with the moment of creation by God. So I'll come to that, but continuing with Tim Bayne's reasoning, he says at the bottom of page 29, what about 2? That's when he says 2, that's the second part of this argument. The claim that things that begin to exist must have a cause of their existence. He says, we certainly assume that there are causes for the existence of ordinary macroscopic objects, such as cabbages, kings, and kangaroos. However, number 2 is very far from being axiomatic, for quantum theory seems to be committed to the possibility of uncaused events. Leaving that point to one side, we should certainly be cautious about assuming causal explanations when considering the Big Bang itself, for we are here considering the explanation of nothing less than the universe itself. And it is unclear whether the very existence of the universe is something that has a causal explanation. Okay, so he's mentioned quantum theory. He's mentioned the Big Bang theory, which is based on general relativity. And he doesn't elaborate. It's a very short introduction, but I'll use this opportunity to bring in those theories because I think they have a lot to say about the cosmological argument for the existence of God. So, the Big Bang. A gravitational singularity is defined as a point of infinite density. It contains all space and time, but it is itself outside of space and time because, according to relativity theory, if you travel at the speed of light, for you, space and time stop. And according to general relativity, gravity is equivalent to motion through space, and infinite gravity would be equivalent to infinite speed. So you'd be outside of space and time. You'd contain all space and time. The singularity would. And so having said that, I'm just going to read a little bit. So I wrote a book. The topic of my dissertation to get the PhD in philosophy and religion was comparing, it was called Psyche equals Singularity. I'm equating the psyche, or the soul, as defined by the various world religions, with the gravitational singularity as described by general relativity and string theory, which unites relativity theory with quantum theory. So then I turned it into a book, Psyche and Singularity. So I'm just going to read a little bit here from the Endnotes where first I'll read from Stephen Hawking. So Stephen Hawking realized, the idea that the universe came from a gravitational singularity, that actually seems a lot like God. And therefore, although I earlier championed the idea of the singularity at the Big Bang and in black holes, now seeing the theological implications, he says probably there wasn't a singularity, that it would be impossible to have such a thing in existence. So in A Brief History of Time on page 120, he said, many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, seized on the Big Bang model and in 1951 officially pronounced it to be in accordance with the Bible. There were therefore a number of attempts to avoid the conclusion that there had been a Big Bang. So notice the attempts to avoid the idea of a gravitational singularity were motivated not so much, according to Stephen Hawking, by the science, but by the theological implications, because the idea of a singularity seems an awful lot like the idea of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent being giving birth to the universe. And that is exactly what Pope Pius XII said in a speech entitled The Proofs for the Existence of God in the Light of Modern Natural Science, Address of Pope Pius XII to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, November 22, 1951. Okay, before I read that, it's also important to note that the Big Bang Theory was developed by a Jesuit priest, Georges Lemaitre, and he was the one who said, look, Einstein, your general theory of relativity implies space-time is expanding. That means in the past it must have been contracted into a point of infinite density, the primeval atom. So the Pope at the time said, this is proof for the existence of God. Then Lemaitre later said, you shouldn't have said that. You're going to turn people, I think, against it. And that did happen, according to Hawking. When the Pope said the Big Bang is proof for God, then a lot of scientists said, therefore there must have been no gravitational singularity. What we call the Big Bang from a point of infinite density is a Big Bang from a point of extreme density, but not infinite, because that would be like God. But here's what the Pope said. He said, in fact, it would seem that present-day science, with one sweeping step back across millions of centuries, has succeeded in bearing witness to that primordial fiat lux, uttered at the moment when, along with matter, there burst forth from nothing a sea of light and radiation. Thus, with that concreteness which is characteristic of physical proofs, it has confirmed the contingency of the universe and also the well-founded deduction as to the epoch when the cosmos came forth from the hands of the Creator. So, the Big Bang Theory is appealed to as proof for the existence of God, because it says the material cosmos came from an immaterial point that contains all space and time, but is itself outside of space and time, according to the laws of general relativity and quantum mechanics, and holographic string theory. So I'll come back and give a little more detail about that, but I think in this context it was appropriate to discuss that the Big Bang Theory is a central part of natural theologians like the Pope who are trying to prove the existence of God. So on page 30, Tim Bayne says, a further challenge to the argument that the fact that the universe began to exist proves that it had a creator, God. He says another challenge to that concerns premise 4, so that the creator of the universe must have been a personal God. He says, even if we grant that the universe began to exist and that there must have been a cause of its existence, it is a further question whether this cause must have been an agent, let alone the kind of agent that might be a fitting object of religious devotion. Indeed, to the extent that the idea of an atemporal cause is intelligible, it would seem to point in the direction of impersonal entities and forces such as gravity, rather than a personal agent, for personal agency seems to require temporality. So we discussed that in a previous video. If God is simultaneously aware of all of the past, the present, and the future, that seems to mean he's not a person, because people act in the present with memories of the past and no knowledge of the future, and yet God can't act like that. So how can God be a personal agent? And so then the question is, well, are humans capable of knowing the past, the present, and the future? And in extreme cases they are, especially near-death experiences, when people claim that they hurtle through a dark tunnel towards a point of infinite light, that they relive their entire life simultaneously, their whole life flashes before their eyes, and then they get out to the border of the universe where they are one with the past, present, and future of the cosmos. That was part of the book that I wrote. I'm bringing that in this chapter because natural theology says you can examine the cosmos and discern the existence of God that way. Well, one way would be, and this is what Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, one of the co-founders of quantum mechanics, they attempted to prove the existence of what they called the God Archetype, or the unus mundus, or the archetype of the self, this omnipotent source of all being, source of mind and matter. They said, here's their experiment: look for mirror symmetries or a parallel between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics. And that would be evidence for the existence of this omnipotent archetype, the God archetype. So it's natural theology. Here's one parallel that you can see between psychology and physics, and that's this idea of the light at the end of the tunnel. That's a cliche. We've all heard that word because it's a fairly common experience when people's heart stops and then they start again and they come back and they say, I was hurtling, my consciousness rose above my body, I'm looking down at it from the ceiling, and then I'm accelerating faster and faster until I'm hurtling through a dark tunnel towards a point of infinitely loving light. So I went over that. Here's what relativity theory says you would see if you could travel at the speed of light. All of the light, even the light directly behind you, all of the light in the universe would get pulled into a single point. From your perspective, it would seem to be a single point containing the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe at the end of a dark tunnel. That's what you would see if you could accelerate at the speed of light, or endure the equivalent gravitational tidal flow at the edge, at the event horizon of a black hole, where space-time is contracting toward the central singularity at the speed of light. You would see the same thing. All of the past, present, and future of the entire history and future of the cosmos would be condensed into a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. So that seems to me more than a coincidence. Why would these recurring near-death experience accounts perfectly reproduce what relativity theory says you would experience if you could do what they said they were doing, which is hurtling through space-time faster and faster and faster? So that's just one example of techniques of natural theology that can be used given the implications of 20th century physics, which Tim Bayne admirably discusses briefly in this very short introduction. And I'm just explaining it because it is the area of my particular focus, so I figure I could share a little bit here. But on these exams, this introduction to religion class, I'm not expecting you to get that deep into things. You can draw from this video and express it in your essays. You can have any opinions you want, so long as you root them in knowledge of the text, as I've said before. That's what I'm grading on. You've read the question, do you find his challenges to the temporal or the atemporal version of the cosmological argument for God's existence convincing? Why or why not? Yes, I find them convincing. No, I don't. Okay, that's good. I'm interested to hear your reasoning for how you came to that conclusion based on the text. Okay, so, and also, before I move to the atemporal version, he says, why would we suppose the cause of the universe must be a person? Why not something impersonal like gravity? Okay, I agree. It is gravity. However, I'm defining gravity when it gets infinite. That is what I equate with psyche. Infinite gravity equals psyche. That was based on Carl Jung, the famous psychologist's equation. He ended a letter he wrote to a friend of his on February 29th, 1952, I believe, or was it 1951? I get it mixed up with Pope Pius XII's proclamation, but at any rate, he ended the letter with this equation. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. He was thinking in terms of general relativity. How come you can't measure psychic energy? Where is it? He says, maybe you can't measure it because it's infinite. Highest intensity in the smallest space. That means psyche equals singularity, because the highest intensity is infinite, and the smallest space is zero, and that's what the definition of a singularity is. A point of infinite density with zero extension in space. So a point of infinite gravity created the universe. That's the Big Bang. If you equate the point of infinite gravity, which is the source of space and time, but it stands outside of space and time, and is omnipresent for various reasons that I'm not going to get into, then you can do what Pope Pius did. And he says, oh, this is a good theory for how existence came forth from the hands of the Creator. The hand of the Creator would be the singularity itself, which has all of these qualities of the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent God. Only thing it lacks is personality. But if you were to equate a point of infinite gravity with personality itself, that's what you would have. And again, these kinds of implications were not unknown to the physicists. After the Pope made that proclamation, Stephen Hawking said, therefore, they went about trying to say, oh, well, maybe the singularity isn't really infinitely dense. Maybe it's just very, very, very dense. Because infinity implies basically God. And that is anathema to many physicists who attempt to describe the universe without appeals to any kind of divine intervention. All right, so now the atemporal version of the cosmological argument. So the bottom of page 30, or about a little more than halfway down. Let us turn now to the atemporal version of the cosmological argument. Instead of appealing to God to explain why the universe came into existence, atemporal cosmological arguments appeal to God to explain why the world, understood here as the sum of all concrete objects minus God, exists at all. Okay, so why does the world exist at all? Whether it was created at a point in time or not, why does it exist? It must have a reason for its existence. And but before I get into the 5 levels of this argument, the atemporal argument, let me just examine this parenthetical statement he said of defining God, understood here, defining the universe as the sum of all concrete objects minus God. Well, is that possible? If God is omnipresent, but you subtract God from the universe, is that a real universe, or is that an abstraction that doesn't exist? If there is a God, you can't take God out of the universe. You can't define the universe as all concrete objects minus God. Because if you took God away, then those concrete objects would cease to exist as well. So there's a flaw in that definition of the universe if you believe in the existence of God, because then you wouldn't be able to withdraw God from all concrete existence. So having that in mind, let's go to the argument, the atemporal argument for the existence of God. Number 1, the universe is contingent. I'm going to define contingent and necessary after I go through this list. So the universe is contingent, number 1. Number 2, there is an explanation for the existence of all contingent entities. Number 3, the existence of contingent entities can be explained only by appeal to a necessary being. There is at least one necessary being. That necessary being is God. So the universe is contingent. Contingent means it could have been otherwise, a fact which didn't necessarily have to be that way. So the fact that I just held up my right hand is a contingent fact, because I could have held up my left hand, which is holding the book, or I could have kept my hands down. You can imagine me not lifting my hands at all. But you can't imagine 2 plus 2 equaling 5. You can pretend you can, but try, and you wouldn't be able to form a clear conception of 2 plus 2 equaling 5. You wouldn't really be able to understand how that's possible. But it's easy to understand how it's possible for me not to have lifted my right hand. So all contingent facts require an explanation. You can't explain why 2 plus 2 equals 4. It just does. It's a self-evident truth that requires no explanation. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Why? Because when you add 2 things to 2 other things, you have 4 units. You can use different words, dos and quattro, or whatever symbolic language you use, but logically, 2 items plus 2 items equals 4 items, or 1 item plus 1 item equals 2. That's a necessary mathematical truth. Contingent things, however, require an explanation. They're not self-evident. So the universe itself requires an explanation. You can imagine the universe never having existed. Can you really, though? If the universe never existed, you wouldn't exist to be able to imagine it not existing. So again, this is a very short introduction, and I'm just introducing you to some of the possible questions that arise with these issues. I'm not expecting anyone to have a definitive answer in some complete cosmological awareness of God or the absence of God, but just be aware of the fundamental alternatives and choose one tentatively and explain why you think that way and base your answer with short quotes from the text. Okay, so that's what a contingent being is. It could have been otherwise. So I'll read here what he says. Abstract entities such as numbers seem to exist necessarily, but particular concrete individuals, cabbages, kings, and kangaroos, not to mention you and me, seem to be contingent. Indeed, the universe as a whole seems also to be contingent. Again, taking the universe to refer to the sum of all concrete entities other than God. So again, that's problematic. If God exists, you can't subtract God from the universe if you define God as omnipresent, which this book is assuming that's what God is. So in other words, it seems to be entirely possible that there might have been nothing. Premise number 1 of the argument seems reasonable. Premise number 1 is the universe is contingent. But what about 2? Why assume that there is an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing? So, okay, there is an explanation for the existence of all contingent entities. That's the second part of the atemporal argument. So why? Why must there be an explanation? Maybe there is none. Maybe things just happen. They happen spontaneously in a purposeless universe, and there is no explanation for why it happened. You could maybe describe the physical processes that unfolded, but what got it going to begin with? Maybe there is no answer. So he says, I think the fundamental appeal of number 2, that everything that's contingent requires an explanation, the fundamental appeal of that derives from what the philosopher Robert Nozick has called the presumption in favor of nothingness. The idea is that inhabited worlds, that is, worlds that contain things, pose explanatory questions that are not posed by empty worlds, that is, worlds containing nothing, not even space and time. So he says, all right, I get it. If there's something there, it requires an explanation. How did this thing get here? If there's nothing there, no explanation is required, because nothing doesn't require to be created. So it's the presumption of nothing. Tim Bayne says, the presumption of nothing is attractive, but it is not uncontroversial. Some theorists argue that the very idea of empty worlds is incoherent, and he gives some reasons why the presumption of nothing may be problematic. So going on to the next paragraph on page 32, the second sentence, he says, but it does not follow from this that there is an explanation for the existence of contingent entities. So he says, the presumption of nothingness tells us that the default state of reality is that of non-existence, and thus that the existence of contingent entities requires an explanation. But he's saying even if it requires an explanation, that doesn't mean there is one to be had. The claim that there must necessarily be an explanation for every contingent thing is called the principle of sufficient reason. And then he says, commitment to PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, appears to require that the universe is fundamentally intelligible, a claim that is by no means obviously true. Okay, so the atemporal argument for the existence of God rests on the claim that all contingent things require an explanation, and that the only thing that can explain a contingent being is a necessary being, and that there must at least be one necessary being to explain the existence of the cosmos as a whole, and that necessary being is God. So what are the challenges that Tim Bayne presents to that argument? We've been going over that, and that is question number 7, part B for exam 1. So continuing on page 32, he says, what about premise 3, the claim that the existence of contingent entities can be explained only by appeal to a necessary being? One objection to 3 is that we don't have a good grasp of how the actions of a necessary being, such as God, might account for the existence of contingent entities. If we had a conception of how it is that an immaterial God could both create and sustain the world, then 3 might be justified. So again, 3 is the claim that contingent beings must be explained by a necessary being. So he says, if we had a conception of how it is that an immaterial God could both create and sustain the world, then 3 might be justified, but it is far from clear that we do have such a conception. So how could an immaterial God create and sustain the world? So again, I will appeal to the Big Bang theory, because the gravitational singularity is not a material thing. It exists outside of space and time. So however you explain the Big Bang theory creating and sustaining the universe, the same could apply to God. He asked the question, and I think that would be a pretty good answer. And just to briefly mention this, in the history of 20th century physics, and I provided a video summarizing that as in one of the optional YouTube videos for this class. It went from special relativity to general relativity to quantum mechanics to string theory, which synthesizes quantum mechanics and general relativity, which before string theory, they were at odds with each other. You couldn't use quantum mechanics to describe things at the realm of general relativity, which is gravity, and you couldn't use general relativity to describe things at the atomic level. But what about a gravitational singularity? It requires both languages. It's infinitely small, so quantum mechanics is required, and yet it's infinitely heavy, infinitely dense, so general relativity is required. So string theory solves the problem. The bottom line for string theory, in the early 1990s, they came up with holographic string theory, Leonard Susskind and Gerard 't Hooft. And it says that space-time is expanding from the singularity of the Big Bang, and this expansion rate is exponential, so it reaches the speed of light at the horizon of the cosmos, which is the spherical border of the cosmos, where space and time are expanding at light speed. And the effect of that light speed expansion is that it freezes the past, the present, and the future at each point of the encompassing sphere, and then that information radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation on these fundamental threads. That's holographic string theory. That's the most, it's controversial because you can't perceive these threads. They're too tiny for current technology to perceive. So some people dismiss it as an empirical science, but others embrace it as the culmination of 20th century physics because it unites relativity theory and quantum mechanics. But at any rate, that image of the universe, that picture of the cosmos with a central singularity and an holographic horizon is very similar to the cosmologies of the world's religions, including Christianity, because it was Plato's cosmology, and St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas both adopted that cosmology, that God, and specifically this outermost sphere, the city of God, where the past, the present, and the future coexist. It's the book of life, which the Hindus call the Akashic record. So with that close parallel between these ancient religious cosmologies and holographic string theory cosmology, I think natural theology has some good new material with which to work to try to find plausible reasons why you could believe in an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent God, which is what this book is about. Is it plausible to believe in such an entity? And I think that those questions should be taking place within the most advanced cosmology available, and that would be holographic string theory. Okay, so the final objection on the bottom of page 32 to the cosmological argument is that God's existence seems to pose explanatory problems of its own. Advocates of the cosmological argument claim that God's existence doesn't need to be explained in the way in which the existence of the world does because God exists necessarily. So then here's the question, is God a necessary fact or is God a contingent fact? And the question is, can you imagine God not existing? Well, it would seem that you can, because a lot of people don't believe in God. But even though they don't believe in God, they still have a concept of that in which they don't believe. Is it possible to conceive of a world where there's no conception of God? That's I don't know if that is, because a lot of people, like Carl Jung, say it's an archetype of the collective unconscious. You can't escape. It's a lens of cognition that humans instinctively think in terms of God. But then others could easily say, well, I don't. Maybe you do, but I don't. So is God a necessary being or is God a concrete being? And if God's a concrete being, then God doesn't, and concrete meaning you could imagine God not existing, then if you have to appeal to a necessary being to explain all contingent facts, wouldn't God be just one more contingent fact? So that's a kind of a complex question. I'll read what he says here on page 33. But could a concrete being such as God exist necessarily? It is one thing for abstract objects such as numbers and propositions to exist necessarily, but it's quite another to describe necessary existence to a concrete particular. After all, ordinary entities such as you and me are regarded as contingent because we can conceive of their non-existence. But intuitions of contingency are not limited to ordinary concrete particulars, such as cabbages, kings, and kangaroos, but seem also to apply to any concrete entity whatsoever, including God, if there is a God. Okay, so a concrete being. Is God a particular concrete being that can be differentiated from all other concrete beings? And is God a contingent being? Can you imagine God not existing? Or is God a necessary fact that you can't escape the concept of? When I was reading this, what came to my mind is if God is everything, then God unites all pairs of opposites. So necessary and contingent, that's one pair of opposites. If God's the source of everything, then God must necessarily be both necessary and contingent. And how would that work out? I don't know. That would take a whole lot more time for me to kind of work that out, but I wouldn't expect anyone to do that, to take that much time in this introductory class. So I think I've given you enough material with which you can work to formulate your own opinion. And again, you can have any opinion you want. Just because I incline towards saying, yes, there is evidence in natural science for the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient being, that doesn't mean you have to agree with that at all. You can take the opposing perspective. All I'm really grading on is how you link your unique perspective to the book, to the information you have in the book. And if you say, the information in the book isn't complete, but here's what it says, but based on that, I'd add this further, that's great. I just want to know that you've read the book, you understand the basic elements of the arguments involved, and then what's your opinion? So the next video will be about the design argument for the existence of God, that the fact that the universe seems to be ordered implies a designer, intelligent design. Will be the next video.